everyone. This is Tracy and Martina again from Natural Shore to do our little book club for September. This month we're doing Wild and Rare by Adam Regn Arvidson. It's a book about endangered species and threatened species in the Midwest. It came out, I think, in 2018, so it's a few years old, so there's been a couple changes in the policy since this book was published, and he mentions that in the book too, that by the time you read this, things might be different. But I really enjoyed this book. What did you think, Martina?
Yeah, I really liked reading all the sections about all the diverse animals and plants that we have who are in critical need for protection. And the book, in the little Wild and Rare, it says tracking endangered species in the Midwest, and he really does track them. Throughout each chapter, he goes on these journeys with people in the field, and you get this really personal touch. You get to meet all these people through him, and I felt super connected to it. And all these journeys were actually in Minnesota, so
I think a few were outside the state, but the author's from Minneapolis, I believe, and so a lot of them are in Minnesota, and he really goes into a lot of detail about the places that he goes to visit to see these different species, and I thought that was really interesting too. He mentioned several parks, state parks, and wild or SNAs or wildlife management organization or areas, and I kept on adding those to my long list of different places I need to visit. So he, like you said, he goes into really great detail, and it's almost like he's telling a story with each endangered species. We should mention that it's plants, mammals. He goes into insects, mussels. So it's a big range of different organisms that he talks about, and some of them aren't like your big megafauna, like one's a lynx, but then he also talks about mussels, native mussels that are endangered, and things that maybe don't get as much of attention as, like, say, the rusty patch bumblebee, things that are still endangered and need our protection but don't really get as much attention.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed his black and white photographs. It really gives kind of like a vintage touch to it.
The illustrations too are really
I
nice.
love the illustrations too.
And he talks too about how a lot of these creatures, like one of them was the piping plover, how those go over state lines, and even like there's a lot of things that migrate, and so it's really important to have these federal Endangered Species Act and other legislation that can go over those state boundaries, so it's not just one state doing one thing and another state doing another thing. It's important to kind of have these overreaching policies that can protect an animal too.
The Endangered Species Act was actually passed in 1973, and there is a lot of controversy with it and the legislation. It's really hard for them to make a decision. All the species, like, they're not sure which to protect before the other, and I'll admit that is a very hard decision. And there's lots of diversity, as we mentioned, on that list. So
I think he mentioned that there's some school of thoughts that are leaning towards protecting more of an ecosystem versus the individual species themselves, because if you go after protecting whole ecosystems, there's a lot of things under that umbrella instead of just one species. But he also mentions too, like, if you're protecting a rusty patch bumblebee or another butterfly or insect or animal on the endangered species list, that's benefiting other things that live in that species ecosystem as well. So that's really nice. It was just a really, really fun book to read. Really good storytelling throughout each chapter. Like Martina said, you really get a sense of the good work that a lot of these different agencies and the people that work for them are doing to protect these species. You can tell through his writing how passionate people are in protecting the species, and he goes into a lot of science behind studying the species too, without getting too much into a lot of jargon. It's just really easy for people to read that maybe, want to start learning about this topic. And
he also seems to have a geology background.
Yeah.
Because in most of the chapters, he was kind of describing like the rock formations and just the billions of history that went into forming these lands. And I thought that was super interesting to learn about.
Yes. Yeah, no, the geology of the Midwest is really interesting, and that plays a part too in how these species interact on the landscape, and it's pretty interesting stuff to read.
And Tracy, I just wanted to ask you if you had a favorite chapter.
Oh my gosh. I really liked learning stuff that I hadn't learned before. Like I've learned a lot previously about the butterflies he's mentioned, the orchids. He mentions the trout lily, but I really learned a lot about the plover. I learned a lot about rosewood. I didn't know about that one previously. And he goes into the wolf chapter. I thought was very interesting too. There's a lot of controversy about how to manage the wolf populations, and I definitely have my opinions about that. And but he definitely goes into that, how it's really hard to manage these different species that might come in conflict with humans. And who do you put above the other? The mussels chapter, I think I'm going to say that was my favorite because I just learned a lot. Was that your favorite?
That was my favorite too.
It was really good storytelling. I really liked how he talked about the divers.
Yeah, I definitely think mussels don't get enough attention.
No,
they're amazing creatures. They clean and filter our water.
Yeah, and they're getting pushed out by invasive species, so we really need to care about them more. We need to talk about them more. I really liked how they have crazy names to them, like the spectacle case, sheep nose,
snuff box,
Higgins eye, pearly mussel, maple leaf, and they're just really interesting shapes and have an interesting life cycle.
Yeah,
some
of them can live for decades, which is pretty amazing.
So yeah, I really like this book. Highly recommend. Go out there, read it, and thank you for watching.
See you in October.
See you next month.